Hello, in this video we will discuss basic concepts with respect to outbreak investigation. But before we do that, I think it's important just to spell out the natural history of disease, or the way we think about it in a very simplistic way. This is a diagram that illustrates the transition between healthy and diseased outcome, which we have an initial onset of disease usually followed by clinical symptoms. One seeks care, and then there's some sort of diagnosis and or treatment if available. Now, we can take that natural history of disease and put it into different periods, beginning with the infection or exposure period, depending on if we're dealing with an infectious agent or a non-infectious agent, followed by a latent period and an infectious period only in the setting of an infectious disease, and then some sort of outcome, either death or recovery or chronicity. We have the latent period, the infectious period, an incubation period, and a period also during which a person can be symptomatic. So what are these periods? So first I'll define incubation period. This is the period of time from the point of exposure to the agent to the onset of detectable clinical illness. And specifically for viral infections, the incubation period actually can be broken into more distinct phases. You wouldn't be expected to know or understand the prodromal phase in great detail because it's a more detailed infectious diseases concept. But nevertheless, this is the period in time, as I said, from the point of an exposure to an agent to the point that the host becomes or begins to display clinical signs and symptoms of being ill. Then the factors that can affect the incubation period are varied. One is the invasive ability of that infectious agent. That is, depending on how the infectious agent enters the host, can affect the duration of the incubation. So, for example, if the infectious agent enters the host through the blood, then the incubation period may be shorter than if it had entered the host via, say, a respiratory route. Another factor that can affect this period is the time for replication and growth of the organism to the point that clinical disease is achieved and manifested. And similar to that top bullet, also a factor is the body side of infection. And then most importantly, or very importantly, I should say, it's the level of exposure or dose of exposure of that agent. So a very large dose of an infectious agent is perhaps going to result in a shorter incubation period than the reverse. This just provides you with some examples of the incubation periods for some pretty well-known viral diseases. Everything from hepatitis to herpes simplex to chickenpox. And as you can see, there's quite a range in terms of the incubation period for these viruses. And again, it's driven by the type of the virus, how it enters the host, and the period in time it takes for the virus to replicate. This would also be pertinent to bacterial infections and fungal infections and parasitic infections. The next term is the latent period. This is the time from the infection to the point in which the host is considered infectious. Now, what's interesting or important to note is the latent period can be shorter or sometimes longer than the incubation period. So you can have a period in time in which a person is infectious but isn't illustrating clinical signs and symptoms. So the incubation period in that example is longer than the latent period. And the reverse is true as well, where the incubation period is shorter than the latent period, so the person illustrates signs and symptoms of infection but remains infectious for a longer period of time. Now, for non-communicable diseases, the latency period is the same as the incubation period. Now, it's important here to think about latent period and incubation period together from a public health perspective. And we'll talk about this more throughout the class, but the bottom line is, in order to stop the spread of an infection, we need to understand the relationship between the latent period and the infectious period. So the distinction between the two is important when evaluating control methods based on symptomatic surveillance. So if the infectiousness period precedes the symptomatic phase, that is, the latent period is shorter, than the incubation period. And a good example of this would be with HIV infection, that the interventions based on targeted controls towards symptomatic individuals are unlikely to be effective, because if we're looking for people with symptoms, they're already infectious before they're symptomatic, and hence they're spreading the infection. And again, HIV is a very good example of that. Now, disease where the symptom onset is coincident with or precedes the infectiousness, such as smallpox, which we don't deal with anymore, fortunately, but we can think of, say, the common flu. There is where interventions are more likely to be controlled using methods based on symptomatic surveillance. So the infectious period is one of the most important determinants of infectious disease dynamics. It can range from days, as in the case with flu, to years, as in the case of situations with people who are untreated with HIV, but also could occur with things like herpes simplex that have a circulating sort of pattern of infectiousness. Now, next I want to talk about the epidemiologic curve. This is a visual display of the distribution of the number of cases of a specific disease by date and time of onset. We use this often in outbreak investigation to learn disease time trends, to determine the magnitude of the disease, the mode of spread, etc. And I'm going to walk you through how we look at these curves now. Now, this next slide essentially provides you with a very detailed breakdown of how we try to calculate the incubation period for a disease using data that are plotted on the epidemiologic curve. I recommend that you read through these and make sure you understand the concept. You won't be ever asked to regurgitate these steps, but it's just one approach we use to try to calculate incubation if we don't already know the incubation for the disease that we're studying. So, want to talk about the types of spread that are most common in disease transmission. The first is a common source spread. This is where individuals are exposed to a single noxious or infectious agent, such as a food poisoning at a wedding or a cafeteria. This leads to a single curve that quickly wanes as because there's no person-to-person transmission. There's a single spike and then it wanes. The next type is a continuous source of spread, and just as it's stated, it's when you have common source exposure that's prolonged. And an example of that would be contaminated water that could lead to cholera infections. This produces an epidemiologic curve that becomes long and flat, and that flatness suggests that the infection comes from a common source with no person-to-person transmission. The next type is intermittent. And this is when we have patterns of irregular cases that reflects the timing and the extent of repeated exposures. In this instance, it's not always clear up front if it's a common source for the infection or varied sources. A fourth type of spread is an index case with limited spread. This is associated with patterns of peaks with spaces in between representing the incubation period. The seminal example here is with Typhoid Mary. She spread the infection to all the individuals. The individuals did not spread it to each other. And then the one type of spread that we always concern ourselves with the most from public health perspective is propagated. And this is where you have a beginning case, an index case, followed by secondary, tertiary, etc. cases, and it leads to this perpetuated cycle of infection. So the common cold, the flu, SARS, H1N1 is a form of the flu, Ebola, etc. were propagated spread infections. So I'm going to walk you through some slides that practice what these distributions would look like. As you see here, this is a single peak. This would be associated with a common source infection, noted by the rapid increase and the rapid decrease because there's no person-to-person transmission. This is an example from data from a little dated now from 1986, illustrating this rapid increase in the number of cases of Salmonella, and a dramatic decrease again because of the lack of human-to-human spread. Here's a second example. This is illustrated by 2 peaks rather than 1 peak. So this would most likely be due to an intermittent spread. So this pattern suggests a continuous exposure to some sort of contagion or infection. Note that the top isn't necessarily perfectly flat, but that the number of cases remain about the same over time. This would be an example of intermittent spread, as it's suggested by the breaks between the peaks associated with incubation. And this pattern here suggests probably a propagated spread, as illustrated by the increases in the cases and then a slight decrease in the increase again due to incubation.